In retrospect, it always seems inevitable that our perception around an issue reached the present point, that no matter who pushed an issue forward or how, it would always have turned out more or less as it is now. So when we hear advocates of climate change say,
"How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood."
it could only have been this way. But what is to be said for the natural human expectation of logical patterns and the habit to view history, paradoxically irrationally, as a linear march into the future? To some extent, the political climate and style of communication around issues is crafted for us by the powerful. Messaging and perceptions of issues is packaged and sold in talking points by visionaries who draw the borders of our reality itself. We see this so well in utopian movements. If you read thinkers of these schools and really release your mind to consider their times free of the constraint of hindsight, one of the most powerful pulls is a sense of inevitability, of the logic and order as they, according to their philosophies, inexorably ascend into the future. Now, of course, we live in the future and look back at these failures. Now, we say, we can so clearly see how hollow their policies were and how mistaken or cynical their promises. But for them, it was so clear, even so logical. And through their philosophies, they shaped their past, their present, and their future, their whole reality, filtered through a lens which now we only study with a detached interest at best, as though we are studying a Greek pagan. We can see perhaps how cleverly these ideologies wove their stories, often in line with the convenience of what was expedient for their leaders. So, the Emperor Augustus was a living god, Napoleon, the human embodiment of French greatness, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the new founder of a modern America free from fear. The line between pure reason and pure ideology is too great a question for me to answer, and one which I think many well-examined lives will place a little differently. Objective truth exists irrespective of our conformity to it. But conversely, reality can only be perceived through a deeply subjective framework of human experience. Finding the balance between them is a task greater than this video and greater than this brain, honestly. But one thing I can say for certain is that there is a mean between these, a zone of thinking which balances these realities. And I think it's useful to imagine it as a wide section rather than a narrow thread of perfection, precisely because the subjectivity of perception is itself a truth. The further a concept is perceived as in the realm of truth itself rather than subjective perception, the stronger and more animated the believer becomes. Sometimes, an idea which may in reality be subjective becomes for the believer in the realm of truth itself. Often, it is not. It is rather the result of practically infinite layers of influence, conscious and unconscious. As with most ancient subjective perceptions, whole modes of interacting with reality have vanished completely from the earth, never given up by the millions of historical people who believed in them. This video is not about climate change. This video is about a man, the former Vice President of the United States, and his cause. There are so many men like him, at least as many as there are causes, but Al Gore represents the nucleus of this dilemma at the intersection of ideology, information dominance, government, and big business. What a leftist might call neoliberalism and a rightist might call globalism. You might think that Al Gore is a has-been, that he's been irrelevant since 2000 or 2006. And you would be wrong. Al Gore has never been more powerful than he is today. He has never been richer, growing his net worth from under $2 to over $200 million since 2000. He's also not constrained anymore by the public. He now has the ability to select when and how he appears to the public, giving him increased control over his image and the ability to focus on his signature issue, green energy. And not just any green energy. No. His green energy. While he and his partners give hundreds of thousands to Democrat presidential candidates, they are richly rewarded with billions in the name of environmental policy. For example, as reported by the Washington Post in 2012, Gore's venture partner, Gore, had been raising money for Democrats to take back the White House, holding big check receptions with Silicon Valley investors. He and fellow Kleiner partners and spouses donated more than $800,000 to Democrats, much of it for Obama and state efforts to get out the vote. At Generation Investment Management, Al Gore's firm, 5 of Gore's principals, including co-founder David Blood, wrote $130,000 checks to aid Obama's bid, according to the Center for Responsive Politics. As Obama was preparing to take office, it was clear his public agenda supporting clean energy aligned with Gore's personal agenda. Obama held a highly publicized meeting with Gore at Transition headquarters in Chicago to talk about energy policy. Later, Obama closely echoed several of Gore's talking points and his plan for public investment in clean energy. Obama even adopted Gore's campaign catchphrase for the effort, "Repower America." This is a matter of urgency and national security, Obama said. We have the opportunity now to create jobs all across the country in all 50 states to repower America, to redesign how we use energy. Carl Browner, a former Gore political operative, became the president's climate change czar, and Ron Klain, Gore's former chief of staff, went to work for Vice President Biden overseeing the stimulus. These connections were underscored in October of 2009, when Jonathan Silver, under consideration to head the $38 billion clean energy loan program, hosted a party to help Gore raise money for the Alliance for Climate Protection. Silver invited the Department of Energy's chief financial officer days before the officer was scheduled to meet Silver to discuss the job. At risk of seeming presumptuous, I want to mention that my wife and I are holding a small event for Al Gore at our home this coming Thursday evening, Silver wrote in an email. I expect there will be about 40 people or so, generally folks who are interested in this issue and have the capacity to write significant checks, and a couple of others with professional involvement in the topic. And, believe it or not, the Obama administration delivered on its promise to promote Gore's green energy, promoting the American Clean Energy and Securities Act, of which Gore said,
I believe this legislation has the moral significance equivalent to that of the civil rights legislation of the 1960s and the Marshall Plan of the late 1940s.
Of course, this highly morally significant piece of legislation would not be complete without some money, and it sure had some. The bill subsidized new clean energy technologies to the tune of $90 billion by 2025, $60 billion in carbon capture and sequestration, $20 billion for electric and other advanced technology vehicles, and a $20 billion basic scientific research and development grant. Faced with this clear conflict of interest, Tennessee Congressman Marsha Blackburn very timidly asked the obvious.
You talked a little bit about people have to have trust in what you're doing, and I think you know that this bill is going to fundamentally change the way America works, and it's going to affect families. We've all talked about how it affects individuals and what it's going to do to their budgets and what it's going to do to jobs in this country. And given the magnitude of those changes, I think it's really important that no suspicion or shadow fall on the foremost advocates of climate change legislation. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of clear the air about your motives and maybe set the record straight for some of your former constituents. And I've got an article from October 8th, New York Times Magazine, about a firm called Kleiner Perkins, a capital firm called Kleiner Perkins. Are you aware of that company?
Well, yes, I'm a partner at Kleiner Perkins.
So you're a partner in Kleiner Perkins. Okay. Now, they have invested about $1 billion in 40 companies that are going to benefit from cap-and-trade legislation. So is the legislation that we are discussing here today, is that something that you are going to personally benefit from?
His defense, after a bit of contemptuous laughter, just trust me.
If you believe that the reason I have been working on this issue for 30 years is because of greed, you don't know me.
No, sir, I'm not making accusations. I'm asking questions that have been asked of me and individuals, constituents that were seeking a point of clarity. So I am asking
I understand
you
exactly
for
what
that
you're doing,
point
Congresswoman.
of
Everybody here
clarity.
does.
Too bad the Washington Post wouldn't report on his insider dealings until well after the legislation could be risked by the insider truth. I think somebody being a politician and a speculator is good enough evidence to eschew standing on honor, but for some of our more credulous friends, perhaps a little more concrete proof is in order. And one of the biggest, most glaringly obvious indicators for those of his generation is,
I think we have a societal moral obligation and practical imperative to try to get the U.S. past these horrific problems that are rooted in the past. And the younger generation, I mean, you know, it's very different for the younger generation. At least that's my impression. Same with like the discrimination against gays and lesbians. You know, young people, they say, what? You know, are you serious? You're going to discriminate against somebody because who they fall in love with and how they were, the way God made them? Really? And I think that as we gain more experience in accepting the reality of who we are as human beings, I think, you know, we can get past that.
in 1981, Gore was quoted as saying with regard to homosexuality, "I think it is wrong, and I don't pretend to understand it, but it is not just another normal optional lifestyle." In his 1984 Senate race, Gore said when discussing homosexuality, "I do not believe it is simply an acceptable alternative that society should affirm." Like many politicians of his era, Gore has never specified what exactly prompted his complete 180-degree change of heart, but regardless of where you stand on the issue, one thing is crystal clear. Al Gore is as predictably false as the rest of them. It's laughable to seriously consider that a "just trust me" should be enough to silence skepticism. And speaking of his earlier career, if you're my age, Gore's public life was well before your time. So, in brief, he is the son of a Tennessee senator. You might describe him as an old-school Nepo baby. He's been on the climate beat since he first entered public office in 1976. It was then one piece of a suite of more brick-and-mortar environmental issues like clean air and water, or wildlife and forestry protections. As Gore's career progressed, he promoted his climate change position more and more, making it a stand-alone issue, one which practically replaced the more bipartisan aspects of climate advocacy. Philosophically, Gore was, as a congressman, very comfortable with the idea that government can be used to enforce standards on the market. And I don't say that as a dig, so do I to an extent. I think most people do. The problem with Gore is that it's very unclear if he has any limitation to this comfort beyond what he thinks he can get away with. He would use the power of government, the regulation, the public coffers, seemingly indiscriminately. Most famously, in the 80s, he thought he could regulate the music industry through stricter labeling and distribution practices. I'm certain he wouldn't even come close to suggesting that today, even if he ever did believe in it to begin with.
If you want to protect that child from unnecessary exposure to inappropriate material, you sometimes need a little help, the kind of guidance that is presented in the movie industry, and it is totally unreasonable, in my view, to expect parents to come and sit down and listen to every single song in the albums that their children buy in order to fulfill their responsibilities as parents.
But don't take from this that Al Gore is hostile to the free market, because as vice president, he ferociously advocated for NAFTA against a coalition of unions, Pat Buchanan, Ross Perot, Donald Trump, and other advocates of American labor.
Now, this is a good deal for our country, Larry, and let me explain why.
But you were hedging early.
Well, we said from the very beginning that we wanted to improve the basic arrangement, which we did with these side agreements. And the reason why this is so important can be illustrated by the story of a good friend of mine that I grew up with named Gordon Thompson, who lives in Elmwood, Tennessee, with his wife Sue and his son Randy. He makes tires for a living. He's a member of the United Rubber Workers, And he's for this because he's taken the time to look at how it affects his job and his family.
If your friend who makes the tire, and he's a union member, is going to benefit from this, why is the unions aligned with Ross Perot? Why do we have this alignment of Ross Perot unions, Jesse Jackson, Pat Buchanan, and Ralph Nader?
Because some of them make the same mistake that, with all due respect, Mr. Perot makes. They confuse the bad trade deals in the past with this one, which is the first time we've been able to get one that's even Steven, with zero taxes on both sides. You know, I told you about my friend Gordon Thompson. The international president of his union opposes NAFTA.
His debate with Perot is really worth a watch, especially with 30 years of hindsight. But suffice it to say, Gore is both a friend of big government and a friend of big business. And insofar as there can be any philosophical through line to his economic policy, the only one I can judge is whatever the self-proclaimed moderate Gore considers to be the center, the norm. And there we find the crucial Gore connection between his two great loves. With Washington and Wall Street on his side, as he left the vice presidency in 2000, all he needed was the center. And as the influential man he was, especially when out of office, he had the ability to speak this center and this norm into existence. And the words he used to do this were an inconvenient truth. His 2006 documentary, which radically shifted discourse surrounding the climate issue, pushing it into the center like never before. The only small problem was that the documentary was stuffed with lies.
Within the decade, there will be no more snows of Kilimanjaro. Within 15 years, this will be the park formerly known as Glacier. Those who go up to see him, here's what they're seeing every day now.
It's 2024, and the glaciers are still here. Now, National Geographic claims 2030, still others claim 2060, and others that the glaciers will actually remain indefinitely. In 2024, however, approaching 2 decades later, we are still able to visit Tanzania and see with our own eyes the glaciers are still there, and snowfall remains apace.
If this were to go, sea level worldwide would go up 20 feet. They've measured disturbing changes on the underside of this ice sheet. Here's Manhattan. This is the World Trade Center Memorial Site. And after the horrible events of 9/11, we said never again. But this is what would happen to Manhattan. They can measure this precisely, just as the scientists could predict precisely how much water would breach the levees in New Orleans. The area where the World Trade Center Memorial is to be located would be underwater. Is it possible that we should prepare against other threats besides terrorists? Maybe we should be concerned about other problems as well.
Despite Gore's panicky picture projecting Manhattan underwater, at the current rate of sea level increase, it would take 1,800 years for the ocean to go up another 20 feet. If the annual average pace of sea rise quadruples, that still puts the 20-foot total increase at 450 years away. And apparently, that's far enough away for Gore to spend $9 million in what the LA Times describes as an ocean view villa with 1.5 acres with a swimming pool, spa, and fountains in Montecito. That's kind of like the private jet thing. It makes no sense. It's totally contradictory to everything they say, and it just sort of dangles there forever. Is there something I'm missing here? If the sea is rising at the rates that he says, why would he invest $9 million in a beachfront property? I almost didn't even include this one because it seems so blatant, so glaringly obvious. It makes me feel like I'm actually losing my mind. Am I the crazy one? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, I could go on, but perhaps more compellingly, the UK courts found, albeit reluctantly, that the film was ultimately inappropriate for educational viewing, only, of course, after Mr. Justice Burton gushed. Although I can only express an opinion as a viewer rather than a judge, It is plainly, as witnessed by the fact that it received an Oscar this year for Best Documentary Film, a powerful, dramatically presented, and highly professionally produced film. It was built around the charismatic presence of ex-Vice President Al Gore, whose crusade it now is to persuade the world of the dangers of climate change caused by global warming. This was hardly a tough crowd for him, and he still couldn't clear the bar of basic accuracy, however padded the landing may be, with elite fawning over the significance of his work. I guess there's a point in life where you've gained enough influence for the script to flip. Where a college paper would have gotten an F, a hedge fund managing ex-VP gets an Oscar and a Nobel Prize. And the damage of this film is the kind of deeper-rooted zeitgeist formation I mentioned at the start of the video, because the debate about climate change was, I think, shaped to the point of no return by Gore's hyperbole. The film hasn't aged well at all. 20 years was a long time to wait to be proven wrong, but here we are. Not only has Al Gore never apologized for these rather embarrassing errors, which, to be fair, as far as I can tell, he's never really even been seriously asked about, he has continued to double down with language only more strident, ambitious, and empirical. The movement and the rhetorical tone around the issue has remained identical and grown only stronger. I think the documentary did exactly what it was supposed to do. Not for the science, not for the truth, whether convenient or otherwise. It shaped the dialogue, irreversibly colored with panicky pressure applied liberally to decision makers. They must act now, now, now. Any pause, any suggestion that the time frame might be a little longer, the effects a little less severe, or the disaster-oriented framework overdrawn, or pushed aside because the task is too urgent to wait for a consensus or to allow for dissent. The glaciers aren't melting in 2030, 2060, or maybe never. The glaciers are melting now, so we have to act now. And what, you might ask, is the solution that has to be pursued now?
In my country, we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is primarily a climate act, $369 billion, which will actually be much larger than that because the heavy lifting is done by tax credits that are very long-term, some of them actually open-ended, and the early investments that have already been triggered by it give a great deal of many reasons for believing it's going to be much larger than $369 billion. So I'm very encouraged by that.
Keep in mind, this is after President Obama's green initiatives propped up Gore's industry an estimated $51 billion, according to the Brookings Institute, with total government spending, both stimulus and non-stimulus, on green initiatives at $150 billion through 2014.
The United States has already been changing. All of these coal plants were proposed in the last 10 years and canceled. All of these existing coal plants were retired. All of these coal plants have had their retirement announced. All of them canceled. We are moving forward. Last year, if you look at all of the investment in new electricity generation in the United States, almost 3/4 was from renewable energy, mostly wind and solar.
And I think it's kind of funny because, as anybody who works for the government knows, funding doesn't mean results. Funding means funding. And as proof of concept, it's worth noting that although Gore has always protested that these technologies are there, completely market ready, he has never been so bold as to venture out himself without hedging his bets on the taxpayer's dime. And while some, like myself, are old enough to remember the Solyndra disaster,
Congress is trying to figure out who's to blame for the collapse of Solyndra, the solar panel company that filed for bankruptcy last week after running through more than $500 million of taxpayer stimulus money.
For the Obama administration, this was supposed to be a shining example of what $500 million in stimulus could achieve. Instead, Solyndra's solar panel factory operated for less than a year before the company declared bankruptcy 2 weeks ago. At a congressional hearing today, House Republicans presented excerpts from emails suggesting the Obama administration rushed the Solyndra loan. Representative Steve Scalise read from an Office of Management and Budget message urging caution.
Quote, "This deal is not ready for prime time. Go to the next slide. 2008, given the time pressure we are under to sign off on Solyndra, we don't have time to change the model.
Jeffrey Zients of the OMB said the administration was simply asking about the timing for a groundbreaking ceremony. Solyndra boasted about its advanced technology, but now there are suspicions its political connections were at least as important in securing its huge government loan. Peter Kolstad was among 1,000 workers laid off when it did fail.
All the news that's coming out, you wonder where a lot of the money went.
Notice the time crunch, the pressure, the urgency that the Obama administration must act now. It may answer the question, why lie, or at least why exaggerate, especially when the majority of the science actually does broadly agree with you, so you don't have to. But Gore has always preferred to politely ignore failures of public investment and go full steam ahead to try and build enough social capital to justify this tax-funded insurance policy. Listening to him, you would think that all these technologies have been market-ready since even before 2008. In all of his interviews, he presumes this premise. The informed citizen ought to realize that this is cheap talk. It's a funding strategy. A microcosm of this very issue is Gore's own solar panel installation in his home, which after paying an estimated $60,000 to install, produced only 5.7% of his monthly electricity consumption, according to the National Center for Public Policy Research in 2017. The point is, many of these technologies just aren't economical at this point. But if Gore can bully enough of the electorate to concede, the money is as good as his. 1993 Al Gore would have been shocked at this level of hubris in the public square.
They have not released the money spent, the contributors, where it's coming from, how much of it is Mr. Perot's, where the rest of it is coming from.
If you can convince the public that enriching these industries is in the public interest, then rather than incurring the risk required of any investment, or even if Gore's protestations of sincere belief were true, he would just invest his own money out of the goodness of his heart. But Kleiner Perkins doesn't bank, it seems, on the goodness of their own hearts. They bank on the goodness of your heart, and they rake in profits at the expense of the taxpayer. They are unwilling to pay themselves, despite the fact that he was wrong, provably wrong in the hindsight of the current snow on Mount Kilimanjaro. The vision, the narrative has shaped itself into an inevitable reality all its own, fueled by the investment capital, government money, Hollywood and media approval, academic accolades, and most importantly, Al Gore's favorite renewable resource.
The business community and the leaders of nations throughout this world must go together to safeguard the future. We have everything we need to do it, with the possible exception of political will. But we know that political will is a renewable resource.
We can solve this crisis. We have everything we need. The one factor that people worry we may not have in sufficient quantity is political will. I also came here to recruit you. We need your help. And I'm dead serious. Some of you are already involved in this. Those of you who are not, you think back to what you thought about the climate crisis 5 years ago and compare it to what you know now. And then project forward a few years. I guarantee you the difference is going to be starker still, because it's getting worse faster than we're deploying the solutions. We have the ability to do it. And where the amount of political will necessary is concerned, please remember this always. Political will is itself a renewable resource.
The rest of us have to reform these international institutions so that the people of this world, and including the young people of this world, can say, we are now in charge of our own destiny. We're going to stop using the sky as an open sewer. We're going to save the future and give people hope. We can do it, and remember that political will is itself a renewable resource.
Al Gore is truly an innovator. I say that without a hint of irony. There has been no more concrete, specific example of an industry, a person, and a cause so well linked, so perfectly tied together as Gore. Big government, big capital, and big ideology. The type of capitalist who knows that your money only goes so far. It's your heart and your belief that unlocks the truest potential. Why does he bother with the ostentatious lies? Why does he insist, like in the case of Solyndra, on rushing taxpayer investment in what he knows is underdeveloped tech? Because he's taking a gamble on your mind. He's taking a gamble that if you believe hard enough, pressure your congressman loudly enough, bully your skeptical friends confidently enough, if they even bother to dissent at this point, and trust him radically enough, he can move the very fabric of the country, our history, and the culture of the globe itself into his palm. And he understands, I think, that it isn't the money, it isn't the institutional credibility. Both of these things are only prerequisite. Ultimately, it is the belief in the heart of the average person which will enshrine his reality sustainably into the narrative of history. And in order to be part of his history, to access the capital, to get the job, you must pay homage to Gore's reality. A job is no longer a job. It is a conscription in the promulgation of the message.
The world is shifting toward sustainability for lots of reasons. Companies represented here, you talk to your HR, you already know this, you don't have to talk to your HR head to know this. When you're trying to hire the best young women and men coming into the firm, they're interviewing you now at the same time you're interviewing them. And if they feel that you don't share their values, including a shared commitment to try to avoid destroying the future of humanity, then they're going to go work for some other firm that does. And a lot of investors who are not scared off by this kind of political nonsense are saying, yeah, look, we want to put our money to work in a way that gets good returns, but we don't think you have to sacrifice value for values. We see the world changing too, and we want to put our money to work in support of these companies that are placing bets on where that buck's going to be.
This is the only thing about Al Gore I find to be genuinely sinister. Most of his flaws I've described, I kind of just write off as normal crony capitalism in 21st century America. I don't love it, but it is what it is. This aspect of Gore, however, really bothers me in a way the other aspects don't. And I think it's because as a younger professional, I see what he's talking about, this do-good attitude of the HR pronouns and bio type. This is probably Al Gore's most important impact on American culture. He portrays himself as responding to a market, and insofar as he is doing so, he responds only to the market he has himself created. To work at Kleiner Perkins, to work in investment capital, you must embrace the cultural standard he has set, the cultural vision of what he thinks doing good looks like. We know this because ESG scores were not invented by budding investment bankers. They were created, promulgated, and now defended by Gore and company. Cultural visions, even Al Gore himself didn't meet earlier in his life. It's a good thing current Al Gore isn't looking to hire past Al Gore, otherwise he never would have existed. And of course, ESG is not some broad principle of courtesy or decency in the workplace. There are very strict and narrow prescriptions of what exactly doing good looks like for Kleiner Perkins and the millions who they affect through their ESG scores and hiring practices. I don't think it's too necessary to get into those here. They're quite well known. It is, however, worth noting that according to the Harvard Business Review, researchers at Columbia University and London School of Economics compared the ESG record of U.S. companies in 147 ESG fund portfolios and that of U.S. companies in 2,428 non-ESG portfolios. They found that the companies in the ESG portfolios had worse compliance record for both labor and environmental rules. They also found that companies added to ESG portfolios did not subsequently improve compliance with labor or environmental regulations. This is not an isolated finding. A recent European Corporate Governance Institute paper compared the ESG scores of companies invested in by 684 U.S. institutional investors that signed the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment, or PRI, and 6,481 institutional investors who did not sign the PRI during 2013 to 2017. They did not detect any improvement in the ESG scores of companies held by PRI signatory funds subsequent to their signing. Furthermore, the financial returns were lower and the risk higher for the PRI signatories. The conclusion to be drawn from this evidence seems pretty clear. Funds investing in companies that publicly embrace ESG sacrifice financial returns without gaining much, if anything, in terms of actually furthering ESG interests. Just like with his promotion of green tech, Al Gore's actions here do not really conform to what one might expect from a Chicago school rational market actor, at least not according to the traditional economic notions of what an actor is trying to achieve through the market. But as with Twisted Sister or NAFTA, it has never been Al Gore's style to seek broad-based economic gains. It has always been a cause, his domination over the broader culture, language, and even the contours of reality itself. For us normals, the stratification of values demanded by ESG is happening at a dizzying speed, and while, if you can believe it, I actually do speak fluent lib, so I'll probably be okay. That's also how I know that Gore speak style ESG libs are quickly forgetting they're not the only people who exist and have value to our society. The boundaries of their reality have been very stolidly set, and for the foreseeable future will remain set. Because even those who dissent from Gore's doing good a little bit, like me, lay our true voices aside. What else can we do? For now, the chokehold from Gore, Schwab, and Harari dictate not only what can be said, but how and when, and such is life for a 21st century normal. Ultimately, I don't really think it is all about the money for Al Gore. I think he's concerned about his legacy, and what I can only imagine must be the tremendous thrill of speaking reality into existence. And I'll be honest, there's something actually very cool about the real Al Gore. He's like a modern Florentine, very clever and rich, using government and business and art and media and ideology to push himself into history. And I say the real Al Gore because I just can't think of somebody who spends 66,000 kilowatts of electricity, the equivalent of 6 average US households for a year, just to heat his pool as a true believer. I just can't do it. But again, it's not the content of the legacy, it's the legacy itself. And in that way, I think Al Gore is aspirational. He's left his mark. His personal doctrine has become unshakable orthodoxy for most of our contemporaries. For most of us, we leave our legacy only with those we love. Our circle of descendants, children and grandchildren, or our friends. For the elite few, they try their hardest to carve out a place in the pantheon of true influence, to carve their place into the hearts and minds of the masses. And this is the true mark of the elite leaders. Al Gore, for good or bad, has used every avenue, every opportunity to place his cause in the imagination of millions, and he has succeeded. Not even this is permanent. The good news is that the situation will resolve itself. The tech will be ready eventually, and if Al Gore is still alive at that point, he will doubtless claim complete vindication, and that will probably be that, and history will forever smile warmly on this FDR-style visionary. This history textbook, sponsored by Apple.
When any great moral challenge is ultimately resolved into a binary choice between what is right and what is wrong. The outcome is foreordained because of who we are as human beings, 99% of us. That is where we are now, and it is why we are going to win this. We have everything we need. Some still doubt that we have the will to act, but I say the will to act is itself a renewable resource. Thank you very much.